I'd like to welcome all of you to our afternoon panel discussion here. My name is John Henry Crosby. I'm the founder and president of the Hildebrand Project, which is an affiliate of the university and based here. And it is a great honor for me to be able to host, moderate this panel, and I'll say a brief word of introduction for both of our speakers. So we will hear first from Simone Rizkallah, who is the Director of Program Growth at Endow. And for those of you who don't know what Endow is, you should. But Endow exists to promote the Church's documents, particularly, I think, the Pope John Paul's letter on the genius of woman, to women in the Church today, so that they can discover their true identity. And there's the dimension of a prophetic witness that these documents have in the life of the Church. So Simone works with Endow, and I've had the pleasure of being a guest on your podcast. It's a wonderful organization. She's also the daughter of Armenian immigrants in Egypt, if I understand that correctly. So for her, the issues of religious freedom, religious liberty are deeply personal, and she's devoted a great deal of her energy and attention to that in her life. So Simone, I'll invite you up to speak first. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Just gonna look at the time. All right. Look, if it's true that, as Newhouse said, culture is the root of politics and faith the root of culture, then just so we have a firm grasp on the obvious, things are not good. Thank you, Father Antoine. He got me riled up. I was like, yes, I'm always the hot-blooded Egyptian, but there's someone else here. All right. Listen, how do we revive withered spiritual and cultural roots, right? So that the public square can produce beautiful and healthy fruit. How do we do that? And I very much resonated with something that Mary Eberstadt wrote in the National Catholic Register. When Andrew invited me to speak on this panel, in this conference, Catholics Against Antisemitism, I thought, well, isn't that already a thing? And I guess I really did think it was. And then when I started letting people know about this conference, the reactions that I received to even participating in it were very eye-opening for me. That's the truth. Look, it's not enough merely to exorcise a demon. And the root of anti-Semitism, as Andrew Dorn mentioned last night, it's a spiritual evil, and it is clearly demonic. And that makes sense. It makes sense that if the Jews are God's chosen people, as Robert Nicholson said yesterday, conduit of grace, it makes sense that there would be a demon assigned to it. And I don't know how many of you listened to Sister Marian James, but something that she said is that the evil one is like a sniper, right? So if these are God's chosen people, then he's going to go straight to the target, right? This is true in all of our individual spiritual lives. Our wounds become our weapons. The place that we're supposed to especially bring God glory is the place that we are very uniquely and particularly attacked. But exorcising a demon or the demons isn't enough. And if you remember Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 12, when the impure spirit comes out of the person, it goes and it seeks a place to rest, and it doesn't find it. And then it says, I will return to the house I left. And then it goes and takes 7 more spirits, more wicked than itself, and the final condition of the person is worse off than the first. So it's not enough merely to purge demons, demons in the church, demons in the world. The church and the world must also be consumed by the Holy Spirit. So reviving our cultural roots means a return to our spiritual roots. And as Pius IX reminded us in 1938, spiritually we are Semites. We have to go to our roots. That's what this panel is about, our roots, our elder brothers and sisters in the faith. And listen, before I give you the counterterrorism Judeo-Christian strategic plan, Thanks, Father Antoine. Let me tell you a little bit about my weird life. We are Egyptian Armenians, and the reason we ended up in Egypt is because of the Armenian genocide, the first genocide of the 20th century. And you may know the story of when a Nazi official was questioning Hitler on how you were going to get away with the Jewish Holocaust. He remarked, well, who remembers the annihilation of the Armenians? 2023 has been a very bizarre year for Armenia and for Israel. If you know what's going on in Armenia, we lost a land called Artsakh that Armenians have been occupying since the 7th century BC. Obviously, you know, it's a very, very odd, weird, and dramatic, horrifying year also for Israel. I find it interesting, because of my interest in the prophetic, how the Jews are God's chosen people and suffering so much in a particular way this year, obviously. And then the Armenians being the first Christian nation. Noah's Ark landed in Ararat 10 years before the Roman Empire declared Christianity legal, not official, but legal. The Armenian nation declared Christianity its official state religion. So I think about these things, spiritually being a Semite, because I am a Catholic, and also being an Armenian Catholic. How come this is all happening now, and what is our response to it? I always figured that the reason I had so many Jewish friends growing up is because we shared generational trauma, and we really loved our grandmothers, and we could relate on anxiety. I just thought that was why. But then I realized that, especially being an American, this closeness to family and community and tradition was the heart of why organically I just came to have many Jewish friends. Also, many of them mistook me for an Orthodox Jew because I had long hair and would wear long skirts. And so it was either a homeschooled Catholic girl or an Orthodox Jew. And I was happy for the mistake to be made. And I remember one of my dear friends, Yael, saying, "Are you an Orthodox Jew?" And I went, "Well, kind of. I mean, Catholic, not really, but a little bit, So anyway, we're still friends. And, my dad, an Egyptian and Armenian Catholic, I observed I hate to say it, but we're at a conference about real things, that he wasn't anti-Semitic. And he grew up in certain climates that were. And so somewhat recently, I asked my dad, my exceptional dad, "Dad, why aren't you anti-Semitic? Because people are like sheep. How come you weren't one of those sheep just kind of going with that?" And he said, "Well, I would hear things about the Jews in Cairo, and then I would observe them. And I observed such nobility and such dignity, and I admired them, and I wanted to be like them. And so I knew that whatever I heard was simply not true." When he was a teenager, he found out that his best friend actually was Jewish, had a Sephardic mother from Yemen. And they had to keep their Judaism secret because his paternal grandfather was a Coptic Orthodox Basha, and his maternal grandfather was a rabbi in the Jewish quarter in Cairo. I mean, this is like a play waiting to happen. And that his father fell in love with his mother, and so he'd go to the movies every day because he wanted to buy a movie ticket from this beautiful Jewish woman in Cairo. So did someone make this movie? Anyway, so how dramatic is that? But he had to keep that hidden, and the only place that they could find a safe haven was by converting to Roman Catholicism. Does that make any sense? A Coptic Orthodox dad and a Sephardic Jewish mom, and they had to become Roman Catholics so they could get married and live in Egypt, but I guess that's what happened. So that's a very good story of how the Catholic Church really showed up for the Jewish people in Cairo. But tragically, his best friend's father died when he was very young, and as soon as he died, his mother and his sisters shortly after had to flee to Israel because of the persecution that they experienced in Cairo. Israel was the only safe space, so to speak. So, what's the plan? Well, I'll mention another key document besides Nostra Aetate. and that is one that John Paul II wrote, Dies Domini, the Lord's Day. This is the document where John Paul II asks us to reclaim our Sabbath as Christians. It sounds silly, but if we're going to exorcise demons and reclaim culture, we have to do that by keeping a better Sabbath. We have to. Our Lady of La Salette, and thank you to Margaret from Philos, who you probably dealt with in the front table, for switching me onto this, told me about Our Lady of La Salette. And she said that Our Lady said there were two reasons for why she was crying. The first reason for why she was crying was because of blasphemy. And the second reason she was crying is because of neglect of the Lord's Day. And when you think of the spiritual and cultural power that is derived from keeping the Lord's Day, you can understand why Our Lady sheds tears about this. And this is not just making it to Mass on Sundays. This is about becoming the sort of people who can hear God's voice and respond to it, who are happy. In 1964, the then Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, preached that our century is characterized by a people who are incapable of relating to God. He says this, how far we are from a world in which people no longer need to be taught about God because he is so present among us. I long for that day where we don't have to listen to talks anymore, where we're just living and breathing a life of the Holy Spirit. How far we are from a world in which people no longer need to be taught about God because he is so present among us. And it really does feel like the weaker position because we're obsessed with politics, right? You say, all this violence coming from anti-Semitism. You know what you should do? You should keep a Sabbath. But to say that if you really want things to change, right, you have to become the sort of person who learns how to worship God well. And again, it sounds like a very weak position, but it's also God's position. It's the story of Exodus, right? They weren't just being liberated from the demons in Egypt, right, from these pagans. They were being liberated for the sake of going to the desert to worship God and to bring him glory in that way, the one true God. And if there's one way we can be more Jewish, it's by keeping the third commandment, Dies Domini, the Lord's Day, by becoming the sort of people who worship God well, who pray well, so that we can hear his voice well and respond well and enjoy him, so we can live well. To be able to do that, we have to cultivate the virtue of leisure. That's the prerequisite to being able to worship God well. To be able to hear him, we have to first be the sort of people who have that interior capacity to be attuned to reality. Joseph Pieper in the book Leisure, The Basis of Culture, which I read as a young adult, and I thought this book is everything, because I couldn't quite understand why everything that I was doing as a young American was like never enough. Right? Like I had a pretty good GPA. I had good extracurricular activities, but it was just never good enough. I wasn't busy enough. I was, coffee with grandma for 3 hours. That's a little bit unacceptable. And then I read Pieper's book and I'm thinking, oh, this is the key. He writes that book after World War II and Father James Shaw in the introduction says, doesn't it seem a little bit silly to be writing about a book about leisure when we have all these serious problems like the Second World War? But this is the way. This is the way we're going to reclaim a healthy culture. Because leisure is that mental and spiritual attitude of being attuned to reality. And when you've cultivated that mental and spiritual attitude of being open to reality, then there's that possibility that you can be open to the reality of God. So that book was very healing for me as a first-generation American. Now, the contrary vice to leisure, right, that attunement to reality, that interior disposition to be able to hear God's voice. When you hear God's voice, I recognize who you are. And when you recognize who you are, then you know what you're called to do. When you know what you're called to do, then you can go out and do it. That whole thing. The contrary vice to leisure is acedia, which the Desert Father Evagrius wrote about. And he says this, and I'm not just quoting an Egyptian Desert Father because I'm Egyptian, but it doesn't hurt. He said that he believed that this vice was the most demonic of all the vices, acedia. Interesting for our culture, we're obsessed with self-care. That's the root of acedia, lack of care. It's like secular culture is so good about really telling us what's wrong. And it was the most demonic of all the vices because the heart of this vice is autonomy, is lack of community, which means lack of friendship, lack of faith, lack of family. Pretty much the opposite of what happens when you celebrate a good Lord's Day, or you're the kind of person who builds a life that then is able to truly enter into a Lord's Day. So this aloneness, of course, is what defines our culture. We have an epidemic of loneliness. Mother Teresa said that she had visited many countries and seen much poverty, but the poorest country she had ever visited was the United States, because this country suffers from the poverty of loneliness and being unwanted, which she said was the worst suffering in the world. And I have a ton of statistics I really am tempted to share with you on the epidemic of loneliness. I'll share just one. This is hard for me, self-restraint. 500,000 children are flooding emergency rooms every year in the United States, having mental, emotional, and behavioral breakdowns. 500,000 kids. And pediatricians and doctors are pleading, what do we do? What do we do in this crisis point? We can't do anything. Now you might be wondering, what does this have to do with anti-Semitism? Well, it has everything to do with it, because we have created the sort of people who are breaking down emotionally, who are looking for belonging. And so then we're surprised when there are these movements in the streets, these pro-Hamas movements, or BLM, or woke culture things, or the trans movement, all these things that people are getting wrapped up in, because secular world is really, really good at creating belonging in all the wrong places. So this is playing the long game, right? I like Father Antoine's let's do something now that's actually fruitful, and we do need that. We also need to be strategic about the long game, which is building culture. As Christians, we have to be more Jewish. And I say that the most powerful way for us now to be more Jewish, to learn from our elder brothers and sisters, is to reclaim the Lord's Day, which first means we need to get rid of the noise pollution, be less busy, stop congratulating each other and rewarding each other for all sorts of accomplishments that we were never called to participate in, and to be the sort of people that have space and time for other people. Because I'll tell you this, I was given a lot growing up, but the people who actually incarnated the Christian faith to me were Christians who celebrated the Lord's Day. And it was like a Christian Shabbat thing. It was very Jewish. And they invited me into their home to celebrate a Lord's Day dinner. And I was spiritually adopted into their families. To be the sort of church who can be the sort of people who can spiritually adopt all the existential orphans out there who need to find belonging with us and not in these other movements, is how we're going to play the long game really well. So that's my big, my rallying cry to you. And I think I cannot wait really to see, I hope I see a church that really starts to radically shift in this way. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. Lots of self-restraint there. Well, it is a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce our next speaker, Rabbi Mark Gottlieb. Mark and I have a long and deep history over many years now. I met him when he was teaching at the Yeshiva School for Boys at Yeshiva University, my goodness, 15 years ago perhaps, through a mutual friend. And the point of contact really was Dietrich von Hildebrand. And he, in fact, before I even met you, Mark, you must have been aware of our work, because I remember we received an online donation, and we've had lots of titles and different prefixes, but there'd never been a rabbi before to make a donation to this Catholic project. So it's been a great friendship ever since then, And I have to say that one of the things that means a great deal to me is that Mark formed a very dear friendship with Alice von Hildebrand in the last years of her life and wrote beautifully about her after her passing in First Things. So it was called Alice von Hildebrand, Woman of Valor. So Mark is the Chief Education Officer at the Tikvah Fund in New York. He, of course, had the work prior at the yeshiva school when I first met him. Mark is an extremely accomplished thinker who wears his accomplishment with great lightness. I like to tell people when I'm introducing Mark to them that Mark knows more about Christian theology than most Christian theologians, certainly more than most Christians. It's quite impressive and moving, the example that Mark is to me in this deep knowledge and engagement of the Christian tradition. Mark did his doctoral work at the University of Chicago, where he wrote on the thought of Alistair McIntyre. He's widely published, and I'm particularly proud to say a member of the Board of Trustees of the Hildebrand Project, our vice chair, no less. Mark, it's an honor to have you here with us again. Please join us here.
Jewish protocol requires that one be poteach b'kavod achsanya, which is Aramaic, of course the language that Jesus spoke, for opening or beginning by acknowledging the graciousness of one's hosts. So this afternoon, it's my happy duty to make a couple of quick thank yous. First, to my dear friend John Henry for very warm and overdone introduction, but true in the sense that our friendship is something very dear to me as well. And just thinking we had lunch just a couple of hours ago, and we're able to go from supersessionism in von Hildebrand to what's going on today at Franciscan University of Steubenville and what's going on in the wider world with all its horrors and hopes. That's the sign of a great friendship. The fact that we could be who we are, unapologetically true to our traditions, but loving and caring and very much believing, not only hoping, but believing in the salvation that each of us, God willing, will await one day. So thank you, John Henry, and thank you for being the son of a great man and teacher, someone I'm proud to call my teacher, John F. Crosby. Also, it's great to be back in Steubenville. A couple of you have asked me, is this my first time in Steubenville? And it's actually not. It's my third time in Steubenville, which is not a common thing for a young rabbi from New York City to be bumping around Steubenville, Ohio. But it really is a great place, and the fact that the leadership here at the university made this event a priority speaks volumes of what the life of devotion, the life of faith, the life of humanity that this university is devoted to. So I'm very grateful for Franciscan University Steubenville, for my friends at the Philos Project, Rob Nicholson, who I know many, many years and is an absolute mensch. That's Jewish for really classy guy who also is humble and wears his own achievements very, very lightly and very modestly. It's also an honor to be on this panel with Simone, who I just met yesterday, but is a very memorable personality. And I've already learned so much from Simone and from your wonderful talk. So thank you. Thank you for gracing me with this partnership this afternoon. So many centuries, even millennia before Rod Dreher coined the clever expression, the Benedict option, Jews were living a kind of Benedict option. The late, great Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks called it the Jeremiah option, because he saw in the very verses of Jeremiah that said Jews should always pray for the peace of the city in which they dwell, but without shedding their identity, without shedding their particularity, with being Jews in the fullest sense of that term, but being citizens of a larger community. And I think that's really the key to this afternoon's topic of community, how we can participate in a kind of Jeremiah or Benedict option while still being vital citizens of the republic that we belong to, but preserving our own identities first and foremost, not giving in to the imperium, wherever you find yourself. And we live in a blessed republic, but you remember the heresy of Americanism in the 50s and 60s? This was spoken about in the church. Well, we should always remember that our homes are the sacramental homes of church and congregation, Knesset Yisrael, and the Ecclesia, which is the Catholic Church. And I think that that is really the lessons that Catholics and Jews can both learn from one another and convey, in some sense, to the larger community, to the community outside of our own confessions. So I want to just share a couple of thoughts with you on how to do that. What is the blueprint, or what is the, as Simone said, what's the strategic plan for conveying that sense of a robust religious culture in our communities and making sure that we don't fall into the broader cultural trends that really undermine what we stand for. So, it's interesting, in Jewish tradition, there are a handful of thinkers that are actually much more popular in Christian audiences than in Jewish audiences. I mean, that might happen. I don't think, Lewis is not quite that kind of figure in the Christian world, but I'll give you two examples in the Jewish tradition of thinkers that are probably more popular amongst Christians than the home turf team, the Jews. One is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who everybody knows the Sabbath, right? This wonderful 1951 work, The Sabbath, Its Meaning for Modern Man, a classic. If you want to understand the Jewish or the Hebrew contribution to the sanctity of time, whereas Greece and Athens contributed to a sanctity of place, it was Judaism and the Hebrew scriptures that really built into the mindset or into the worldview of humanity the notion of the sanctity of time. There's a palace in time, and that's the Sabbath. That's Shabbat. And Simone, you spoke so eloquently about that. So a lot of Jews think that Heschel's more of a poet than a philosopher, more of a booster than someone that you could learn a lifestyle, a practical way of living in praxis of Judaism. The other example that I have in mind, and a thinker that I think is popular, pretty popular here at Steubenville, is Martin Buber. A lot of Christians love Martin Buber. It's not that Jews don't love Martin Buber, but that Christians find in Buber this deeply spiritual, deeply existential, maybe even personalist thinker with ich and du, I and thou. Jews find Buber a bit, not vacuous, but a little bit soft when it comes to the rigors and the daily routines, the dynamics of real religious practice in action, because Buber doesn't talk about that. And so I find it it's fascinating that Christians have adopted Buber as a kind of a Jewish patron saint of existentialism that's sort of kosher, because it's Jewish. But Buber did have a fascination, without being a very religious in a conventional sense, certainly in an Orthodox or Orthoprax sense, but he was fascinated by the group of Jews known as Hasidim. This was a pietistic movement that was founded in the 18th century, and Buber was an academic of Hasidus. He really tried to chart some of the elements, the theological elements, the communal elements, and he wrote a number of important essays, but he also wrote a book of tales of the Hasidim, these stories. In fact, I mentioned to you, John Henry, I have a suspicion that when von Hildebrand is quoting in that wonderful essay, that important essay, Jews and the Christian West, he's quoting a story from the rabbis about Hasidim. I'm pretty sure that it's from Buber. But Buber, as a student of Hasidism, would very much know the following teaching from the Hasidim, from this branch of Judaism. It's on the verse in Deuteronomy, chapter 5, verse 30, which retells the theophany at Sinai, this great revelational moment where God descends to Mount Sinai. He gives the Decalogue to the Jewish people. It's a moment of great, almost apocalyptic in the sense of fire and thunder and lightning. It's a very dramatic moment. And after the Decalogue is delivered, what does the Torah say? What does the Bible say? Shuvu lachem le'ohalechem. Go return to your tents. So think about this theologically. At the height of revelation of God to man, the first imperative is to go back to your homes, go back to your tents, live your humble lives with your families, with your wives, with your husbands, with your children. That is the preeminent theological teaching in the wake of the Decalogue and the Theophany. Go back to your tents. Create a home for yourselves where you can embody or you can incarnate this law and this spirit into the humble routines of day-to-day life. That is what Judaism ultimately is about. It's about bringing divinity into this world and moving not just from the immanent to the transcendent, but the transcendent to the immanent, to bringing divinity into this world. And I think the way that Jews have traditionally done this is by making their home life, their educational life, and their devotional prayerful life integrated into this triad of shul, Beit Knesset, synagogue, home, and Beit Midrash, house of study. And they're not only integrated in some conceptual or analytic sense, they're geographically integrated. I live in the town of Teaneck in Bergen County, New Jersey. My neighborhood, there's hardly a car driving on Shabbat. You feel palpably that the Lord's day has really descended upon the community. There's a wonderful article in the First Things Online, the web exclusive, by a fellow by the name of Seth D. Kaplan. And he's really talking about what I call the tether and pang of the particular, or the tether and pang of place. Because place is so central to the Jewish theological mind, and it's this ability to integrate my home life, my prayerful devotional life, and my education life into one. As an Orthodox Jew, I attend synagogue 3 times a day. I heard that the mass attendance at Steubenville is amazing. That's incredible. That warms my heart. I go to shul, I go to synagogue 3 times a day, once in the morning and in the late afternoon and early evening. I usually walk to shul, or I take a 2-minute car ride. I'm not driving to my church where the church is not integrated in a meaningful way into my home life. Or I'm worrying about my son or daughter's play date where I have to, I'm gonna plan. That is what Seth Kaplan calls a functional assist. It's a utilitarian way of seeing connections. You need to do something with your kid, so you'll make a play date. As opposed to the organic way in which my devotional life emanates from my home. I walk to shul every morning. I go to shul in the afternoon. I find there's always a synagogue. I'm always looking, where's the synagogue? Unfortunately, in Steubenville, there aren't too many synagogues nearby, so I'm praying in my room. But when I'm home or in a Jewish community, there's a synagogue. That is central to my day. That's central to my devotional day. That creates a web, a tight web, not a thin network of associations, of activities, of ways to engage with the divine. Now, in Catholic life, there are places. One, I think of Hyattsville, Maryland, or Steubenville, right here. You guys are very lucky that you have a community that does center around place, that is formed around Christ the King, or around the church in town. But most Catholic communities don't have that, or this is something that is dwindling very dramatically and very rapidly. And in this piece by Seth Kaplan, he notes that a Catholic friend once visited his home in Maryland on Shabbat and said, this looks like 1950s America. Now, I want to romanticize about 1950s America, but the idea that this was a little community where everybody knows, the other person. Now that could be annoying sometimes if you all know each other and it feels like a little bungalow colony and everybody knows each other's business. But I'd rather have that than the anonymity of urban life that's devoid of that real, genuine sense of community. Charles Taylor, the great Catholic philosopher, wrote in his monumental, huge, unedited book, A Secular Age. It's very thick and fat, so probably could have used an editor. So this is what he says: virtually impossible not to believe in God in, say, 1500 in our Western society. Because in 1500, there was a natural, again, I don't want to romanticize. I know there's a wonderful professor here that wrote that book on Louis the 12th? Louis the 14th? Yeah. So again, as a Jew, I'm not going to romanticize about that era, but there were elements that were really worthy of imitation. That God was also implicated in the very existence of society, the life of the various associations which made up society. Parishes, boroughs, guilds, and so on were interwoven with ritual and worship. One could not but encounter God everywhere. And that's the kind of community that it's much easier to believe in God, even if it's not a default, but it's part of the furniture, it's part of the rhythms of your day, it's part of the structures and the architectonic of your life. That's what Jewish community can offer the Catholic world to a certain extent, and certainly the broader world. I want to conclude with a quote from a teacher that I adore and that I spend a lot of time studying, and that is Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the great uncle of our friend Meir Soloveitchik of Sali. But this was an essay called The Community. And this is how he defines the community. The community in Judaism is not a functional utilitarian, but an ontological one. The community is not just an assembly of people who work together for their mutual benefit, but a metaphysical entity, an individuality, I might say, a living whole. When the lonely man joins the community, he adds a new dimension to community awareness. He enriches the community existentially. He is irreplaceable. We need to build communities where each human person is irreplaceable. And to do that, we need to start with place. And you have a wonderful place here at Steubenville. It should be the envy of many Catholic communities across the country and the world. And I'm just honored to be able to join you, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.